I'd like to say thank you first to Marco for the invitation, to Marco and Thomas for organising, to Barbara and Michael for their contribution to the whole conference, to Iman, to Coleman, to Sarah, to Emily, to Josephina and David for making this such an amazing experience and just making sure that we all felt seen and loved and supported and enjoyed ourselves. We also did some important work, so can we give them all, this whole amazing team, a round of applause for that? So yeah, I'd be very nervous about this, but well, Marco I think asked me about a year and a half ago, and I basically had 18 months to be like freaked out about this talk. Because you're all lovely and wonderful friends and sort of warm and supportive and generous, but you're also terrifying and brilliant in your various ways in your various places. So trying to bring sort of a focus to all that is really, really challenging, and I'm going to try and do that as much as possible. You can see it, tell I'm nervous because I've actually written hello at the top of my talk. Histories at Risk. Today I'm going to talk to you about this Histories at Risk project that I've been running for about a year or so. It's actually been really nice to have this event as a focus because it's kind of been the end of that project that I've been working on, although we're kind of ongoing, but also because I'm kind of moving back. As Barbara said, I've been working on genetics and DNA for about 4 or 5 years. I'm actually coming back toward thinking about public history theory. I'm writing a 3rd edition of Consuming History for a couple of years' time. So it's nice to start thinking about these ideas that we've all been working through, sculpting, challenging, debating over the last couple of days, and it's been incredibly useful to me. It's also, I kind of put as kind of condition is that I wrote this paper before I came to this conference, and I spent 2 days going, no. So going at the end is kind of problematic for that reason. But you know, hopefully I've managed to incorporate some of your amazing ideas into this, and hopefully we will get somewhere with it. Okay, so this network considers contested histories around the world, seeking to share practice and offer solidarity to those working with history in public. The network recognises that public history is not and has never been a neutral discourse, but now more than ever around the globe there is organised and violent resistance to teaching and understanding of the past. From Russia to Indonesia to the USA to Japan to Brazil to Poland to the UK, history has become weaponised oftentimes by far-right and conservative groups. Doing history nowadays is complex and challenging, as for instance our network member Corinne Fowler, who I'm going to talk about a bit today, can attest, or our associates at the network of concerned historians that Cord mentioned can demonstrate. Histories at Risk is a way of thinking through the public historical issues associated with communicating in a contested past and teaching or researching histories considered difficult or controversial. It's an attempt at thinking about inclusivity in research and teaching and a way of bringing together as much kind of practical experience as we can. We've run sessions on, amongst other things, oral history, women in Iran, NGOs in India, anarchist archaeology, indigenous knowledge in Canadian museums of science, public history in Japan, history teaching in Poland. And upcoming sessions look at archaeology in Eritrea, the use of history in contemporary Russia, and history in Poland. And we work really closely with grassroots organisations in Manchester to think carefully about public memory and commemoration. And as a kind of advert, if you go to the website Histories at Risk, you'll see our forthcoming workshops. The session on Eritrea is happening next week. The sessions on Indigenous work in Canada is happening next week as well. So there's some really amazing things happening. I didn't arrange the Canadian one. My colleagues in Canada did that. It's really cool. So I hope I've listed everyone here who's been involved. This work has been collaborative throughout. My firm belief is that in future we'll need to think of history as a collaborative effort, not just in terms of bringing it together, but in terms of sharing and expressing it. In particular, as we'll see in my talk, ideas of ownership, legitimacy, authority, authenticity, claim, gatekeeping, and priority are deeply problematic for many of the communities that we work with. So whilst any errors you may note today are definitely my own, anything good coming out of my mouth is influenced, articulated, or inspired by the work of these others. When we began this project, we were supposed to write a manifesto, and whilst that never happened for various reasons, I'd like to think that a key outcome of the project has been to further understand what collaboration and co-production might be in public historical work in the future. And that also runs to not being extractive in practice, and hence it does feel slightly odd being here in a great centre of historical culture as a white, European, cis, able-bodied, middle-class professor with a Dutch name from an historic university, articulating and reflecting upon the ongoing challenges of Eurocentric historical thinking and heritage practice. So to attempt to challenge that somewhat, I'm actually going to begin with another speaker. A lot of this work is in dialogue with the poet Suhaima Manzoor Khan, a member of the network and an amazing an activist on her own. She's a poet, she's a writer, she's a thinker. My talk looks to engage with her ideas, her writing, her thinking. I'm structuring most of my work here as a response and engagement with the ideas that Suhaima has articulated. So here is, to start us off properly, is Suhaima reading her poem, Where Is My History? It says, no, it's not working. Yeah, it's working. Sorry, David, are you all right? That's right. Here we go. No, here we go. Here we go. So Suhaima raises questions here of location, of cultural forgetting, of the production of knowledge and the ongoing concerns of decolonisation. Using a slam spoken word style, she interrogates even the very production of poetry as a set of genres within their own colonial epistemologies. In a piece of work reflecting upon the poem, I can't really read this very well, sorry, Suhaima talks about the three senses of where that she talks about in the poem. Where is my history? The location of my past in the subject called history, the material question of whereabouts of the artifacts and objects of my past. And she says, finally, the question of where my past is also became an epistemological one. Often that which is a historical record relating to people of diasporic or migrant backgrounds is not categorized as history, but as religion or supplementary. So Suhaima's thinking here opens up the questions for us of what history is, who it is for, why it might be constructed, who owns it, who calls it history, who controls it, the terminology used, how it enables and constructs power relations, things we've heard about all weekend. But I want to use Heimer's thoughts here on where history is as a series of prompts for thinking about heritage, about activism, that word, and how we might think about public history in the future. Right, we're good. I need a sign. Yeah, cool. Public history has often been defined as multiple and complex. Recently, Paul Ashton argued, quote, perhaps public history might be best thought of as an ongoing, entangled negotiation, as a set of evolved relationships, cultural, economic, environmental, political, and social, involving a range of knowledges and a diversity of people groups and organisations. And I like Ashton's thinking about public history as fluid and multiple, although his definition seems to me to be so broad as to almost disappear here. And I worry that oftentimes that the lack of robust theorization in our discipline sometimes contributes to some of the concerns we talked about this weekend, really. The kind of mass diversity is good, but also leads to problems. Furthermore, the imbrication and negotiation Ashton describes here is increasingly at risk, it seems. I wonder whether this idealized, humanist, Western version of public history needs substantial revision to be more robust, particularly in the face of the challenges that we have at present. So I'm going to work through some ideas related to that now. In particular, I'm trying to, as ever, to think about the placing of theorization in this phenomenon. Public history happens without our impact around the world. We're pretty irrelevant to it, to be honest. But is there any way for us to articulate, analyze, and understand what we think it is? Is it just redundant to attempt to describe it? How else might we be able to articulate our understanding of it? At the moment in the UK, there is an ongoing and increasingly bitter argument about the public nature of history and of history itself and commemoration in public. This argument has been stoked by politicians and newspapers and generally revolves around the ongoing history and legacy of slavery and British imperialism, although it brings in many other aspects as well. Maya Sharma, one of the members of the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Centre, who's part of our network, pointed out this great sketch by James Acaster, which nails the current problem of British attitudes to history and commemoration. He says, finders keepers, so what, shut up. And I kind of like the playground nature of this, finders keepers, and it really is, that's pretty much the basic level of the discussion at this point. The aggression, yeah, we go to the next two slides. But Acaster then says, listen in your defence, finders keepers, shut up. Again, has worked very well for us so far. I like the way that Acaster recognises an us here, a complicit public, but we're as much part of this problem as well others. And this is just a selection from the last couple of days of right-wing press talking about British history. I also like the way that Acaster skewers the stupidity of much of the argument, its pointless violence and its underlying racism. The culture wars that he's talking about in the UK started decades, centuries ago, but they really caught fire in 2020 over one particular incident. This is Edward Colson. We've heard about him already this weekend. On the 7th of June 2020, the statue of Colson was pulled down, not as part of the Black Lives Matter protest, but in kind of associated action, I guess. Colson was a slave owner and a philanthropist. His statue had been subject to protest for decades, and it was unceremoniously dumped into the harbour in Bristol. The toppling of the statue led to debates around the UK and also globally about the nature of public memory. Cities around the country began to review their public realm commemoration practice. Now, this is actually a slide from my third year class on 17th century women's poetry. The reason being, and the reason I'm bringing that up, is that decolonisation for me is both historical and of history, something we need to undertake in multiple spaces, and very much so including teaching. So the Conservative government reacted very strongly. Thank you. To this event. In September 2020, Oliver Dowden, I've got stories about that man, the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, wrote to national museums and galleries saying this: the government does not support the removal of statues or other similar objects, down here. As publicly funded bodies, you should not be taking actions motivated by activism or politics. He argued that it was imperative that you continue to act impartially. He argued that rather than erasing these objects, we should seek to contextualise them or reinterpret them in a way that enables the public to learn about them in their entirety, however challenging this may be. Robert Jenrick MP, who at this point was the Minister of Housing, Communities and Local Government, introduced new legislation about particularly violence towards statues in this way. This is from the official documentation. For hundreds of years, it says public statues have been erected to celebrate individuals and great moments. They demonstrate our uniquely rich history and built environment. And in this legislation, this is law now, we should not try to edit or censor our past. We'll lose our inheritance of the past without proper care. The sentence now for vandalising a statue went from maybe a couple of days to about 3 years. Specifically statues, and we can talk about that in the answers about what, the questions about what that suggests about conservative British government. So the debate around the Colston statue, the legacies of colonialism and public memory, demonstrate an unprecedented moment of scrutiny about how and why history is used in public in the UK. And they're obviously part of a wider phenomenon. Globally, populism has efficiently used nationalist definitions of history to seek to silence opposition. In countries as broad as diverse as Brazil, Australia, Poland, Hungary, Italy, the United States, the past has become a proxy means for the conservative right to attack opponents. Claims rooted in defending particular narratives of history and conspiracy theory have become a rallying cry for far-right groups, for neo-Nazis, for conservative media, for populist politicians. The example of Colston and multiple others seems to open up a new way of thinking about history in the popular imagination. Things in the present suddenly had roots in the past, and a reckoning would have to be made for them, or they would be ignored. Now, whilst this is obviously something we've been teaching and advocating for years, it really took hold in the UK in 2020. Before this, the key narrative in the UK about slavery had been about the commemoration in 2007 of abolition, the celebration of 200 years since abolition in the British colonies. A story which often seeks to centralise British efforts to abolish the slave trade and ignores reparations paid to slaveholders, ongoing imperialism, and the fact that the development of slavery was a UK government policy from 1684 onwards. This is the basis of the historical amnesia that Suheimer pinpoints and the aggression toward those who would seek to change it. Instead, increasingly, we see politicians and far-right figures attempting to inhabit the space that I would call public history, to aggressively define the terms of discussion. The place of history here is England, and one defined by nostalgia, forgetfulness, the centrality of whiteness. The key thing here is staticness, a resistance to change and difference and movement in historical thinking and commemorative culture. And Thomas and I were talking on Twitter about whether there was such a thing as a conservative public history, and I think there very clearly is one ongoing in the UK, and it's near enough being defined and being outlined by various cultural commentators in the UK, right-wing commentators, various journalists. There is a practice, and it is very, very clearly being enshrined, and it works, is the other thing that I think we need to recognise. British historian David Lasoga, my colleague in Manchester, Professor of Public History, wrote about the trial of those who pulled down the Colston statue, and he said this: having established these arguments, Liam Walker QC, representing Sage Willoughby, the youngest of the defendants, argued that the Colston Four were on the right side of history. Jurors were invited to join them there. So as I've said, history is increasingly weaponised and whipped up by the press. However, the problem here is clear. Must there be a right side of history, legally defined, enshrined by state law and process? Is that what we really want? Doesn't that inhabit the binary that we were always trying to destroy? I worry somewhat that history, as studied or as discussed, as we talked about this weekend, tends toward liberal interpretation, and we ignore conservative history because they don't suit us. A good example, and while you're just sort of sagging a little bit, of how this is funny, well, funny, interesting, how this became about the polarization of cultural war rather than the actuality of history, is the defence of the George Eliot statue in Nuneaton. Here is the George Eliot statue. Here is George Eliot's most famous novel, Middlemarch, which he published in the mid-19th century. George Eliot is a 19th century novelist. She's a female novelist who uses a male name. Her most famous work is Middlemarch. I very much recommend this book to you, it's astonishing. She was an intellectual, she was a theologian, she was an anti-slavery campaigner. In Nuneaton in 2020, during a Black Lives Matter protest, several men here sought to protect George Eliot's statue from what they perceived to be a threat to its sanctity. These men were mocked quite aggressively on Twitter and in various bits of social media because they were seeking to protect what would seem to be a kind of neutral statue, someone who wasn't involved in slavery. In fact, who was a high-profile anti-slavery campaigner. So yeah, these guys, there was Black Lives Matter protests happening in Houston. These guys came and basically sort of stood around the statue kind of looking, well, I mean, this guy's he's in veteran's dress, he's an army veteran. We can interpret this picture in various ways, I guess. Piers Morgan, lovely Piers Morgan, always good for a quote if you want right-wing horror. All statues matter, he tweeted with this picture. And Corey Bates, who is one of these guys, said, I'm not against the protest whatsoever, I'm purely here to protect our history. Now, while this seems funny, George Eliot is hardly the stuff of controversy, maybe. It, of course, brings into into focus issues around commemorative culture in general, and indeed the whole point of having statues. Why wouldn't Black Lives Matter target George Eliot, participant, if critic, of a 19th century British culture which enacted the very discourses of imperialism, white supremacy, and epistemological narrowness that Black Lives Matter seek to challenge? Why should we not attempt to understand rather than mock the impetus to defend and protect history in this way? Such conservative aggression as these guys, I mean, they're not very scary, are they? But there is still a kind of interesting way of interpreting this, I think. This can become increasingly disturbing and become so very quickly. As a quick example, I'd like to talk about Corinne Fowler, who I mentioned earlier, who's part of our network. Corinne works on the colonial countryside, wrote a report for the National Trust, digesting all the historical work that had been done on the links between the National Trust and enslaved peoples. Now, to someone who isn't British, it is really difficult to explain the National Trust. This organisation has since 1895 bought up a property that is deemed to be of important heritage value. There are sites around the country opened up to the public, along with their gardens and tea rooms. If you've ever been to the UK as a tourist, it's highly likely you've been to one of these places. If you've been there via a costume drama, you definitely have been part of the dream of Englishness that they tend to represent. And in fact, this is not actually a National Trust house, but it may as well be. Bristol is filmed in multiple parts of the National Trust, and there are a million sites like this. So this dream of Englishness is very, very present in the National Trust's kind of shtick. Next slide, please. Corinne's report, Connections Between Colonialism and Properties Now in the Care of the National Trust, was published online in 2020 and outlined the connections of these houses to slaveholding. And all she was doing was digesting academic work. She wasn't adding anything particularly. It was always stuff that was published. Now, as another member of our network, Linda Brogan, argued, isn't it obvious that these houses were funded by slavery? It feels, unlikely. But yes, clearly it should be obvious. But the suggestion that the National Trust might reveal this work became hugely controversial. Corinne's work was set upon by the right-wing press in the UK and viciously attacked. She says this about it: I had threats to my personal digital security, a lot of hate mail into my place of work, a lot of malicious emails, suggestions on how to kill me under Daily Mail articles, after false reports about my book content. At one point, I couldn't go walking alone. And she actually took a leave of absence from her university position for 6 months to deal with the kind of aftermath of this. And this is not unusual, it's the problem. Popular history has been used by far-right conservatives for some time now as a means for articulating the particular narratives. And increasingly this is recognised, and we've heard a lot about this weekend, but here are just some examples that I grabbed from the internet recently. In the UK, nostalgia, so this is in Vienna. This is Adam Pendleton's work I can't remember which place I went to, in the Museum of Modern Art, one of them. But this is the Robert E. Lee statue. This is an amazing piece of work I would say about reflecting upon what this statue means and how it's been kind of rethought. So I would go to this piece, it's a very, very good piece of work. Sorry, I've lost myself a little bit here. Right, so in the UK particularly, nostalgia is elided into public commemoration and history to create very dangerous political contexts. Politicised language is used to attack the EU and create the conditions for Brexit. This is lovely Nigel Farage, if you can't see him. Don't look too hard, he is particularly slimy in this picture. And The event, Brexit, had as much to do with a warped understanding of history as anything else. Next slide. This is some of the language that was used by some of the key politicians at the time around Brexit, which essentially was a fight to move from this passport to this passport. The danger that the UK might become a vassal state or reduced to a status of a colony. The idea of reclamation very clearly being played here, but also keying into a very old and ancient understanding of what Englishness is. And Brexit was essentially a fight over what Englishness is. Forget the rest of the nation. So it's clear then, as public historians, or as anyone who cares about history is understood in public, constructed, commemorated, or participated with, in short, basically anyone who has anything to do with historical culture, practice, or understanding, it's clear that we have become activists whether we want to or not. And the challenge is to work out how to make that work and to avoid being constructed by others. Now, Corinne's approach is incredibly forgiving, involving painstaking dialogue with some of her attackers and ongoing correspondence with people who have sent her threats. This engaged, participative way of doing things seems to be incredibly hard, but probably the best way forward. And she spent a long, long time engaging with the people who were sending her death threats, talking to people, debating, discussing. It sounds wearing and terrifying and awful, but she has got somewhere, I think. So where is public history in the UK then? And how might we go about thinking about how to defend it whilst acknowledging its ongoing violences toward non-white communities in particular? So at this point, I want to think about public history as in an international context to situate these questions of where slightly further. The first formal meeting of the International Federation for Public History was as part of the National Council for Public History's conference in Ottawa in 2013. Established as part of the NCPH's task force in 2009, the IFPH developed a structure between 2010 to 13, and the first annual conference took place in 2013 in Amsterdam. Public History Weekly launched its blog journal in 2013 with an editorial by Marco, placing it in the field of history and civics education. Public History Weekly immediately pretty much began to engage with the international aspects of public history, publishing, next slide please, Serge Noiret's 2014 article on, oh sorry, can we go back? And back another one, and back another one. Yeah, there is good. Can we go one? Yeah, sorry, there we go. Serge's article on saying 40 years after its institutionalization as a university discipline in California, public history has since spread to other countries. And here you can see the spatial metaphor quite nicely, the spreading. Can we go slightly back one slide? This is something about where public history is. I'm starting to become very interested going over my paper again this morning about the regularity with which space and place and location are part of our discussion when we think about theorizing this. Right. Next. Oh no, say that. So we've become very comfortable with a wide array of knowledge infrastructure for global public history scholarship incredibly quickly. The acceleration of this in like a decade, I would say. Now the reason I mention this in front of many of the people who actually made it happen is to reflect upon the fact that on some measures global or international public history is visibly institutionalized in the past decade. And we're still working out what this is and how we approach it. In the past 15 years, it's grown so hugely. There are multiple courses around the world, multiple new organizations supporting the study and investigation of these concepts. So much of this, as I said, this expansion has been down to the people in this room, and in many ways this is a narrative of positivity. We should be thankful that such ethical, thoughtful, and engaged scholars have been working in this field over the past decade and a half. And in some ways, as the final paper of the conference, I'd actually like just to have us reflect on where we are and how we got here, how impressive this is, and what sort of amazing state the discipline is actually in. But this also means that we get to think about the future. What is this thing? What do we do next? What can we do next? Sorry, can we go back one? Indeed, can we even theorize this any longer? Over the first decades of the North American-focused publication, The Public Historian, various scholars wrote theoretical outlines and definitions of public history. But even trying to do that nowadays seems nearly impossible. I mean, this weekend has kind of shown us in some ways. I was thinking about this metaphor of the space of public history. What is in the middle? And I'm not completely sure what is in the middle of our Venn diagram between us all in terms of what we do, which is good. Well, yeah, which is great that we have just this one heading. But where the points of focus are really interesting, and that diversity I think we have to celebrate, but find a way around some, or way into something. Part of the consequence of this expansion surely is to challenge public history as a nationally based concept at all. My fellow British scholars, Alison Atkinson Phillips and Graham Smith, argue that public history needs to move beyond the national frame. And this seems to me like the right way forward, kind of in my heart, but I'm not sure whether that's actually the case in my head, because increasingly public history is being framed in national context, and increasingly the battle over public history and public is being framed by nationalist and populist groups within those spaces. So I think we need to be really kind of careful about getting rid of nation. So where is it? Let's focus back on the UK briefly again. As part of the Histories at Risk project, Julian Lay from London and I began to think about developing a UK-based public history organisation. It became very clear that it was not clear what it would look like, whether it was necessary, whether it was welcome. What would it be called? What would it look like? Who is it for? Is there a division between practitioner and theorist? Here are some of the key words that came up during the discussion. One of the key ones, I think, right in the middle there, attack. The idea at this point, this very precise point, that there is an attack on history that we need to respond. However, there was also a clear sense from the group that we need to act first, quibble later. That actually, talking about this stuff and being academics about it was not the point. The impetus for activism was necessary and crucial. In the UK particularly, we feel like everyone must stand up. So public history, of course, as a practice and a theory has been around for much longer than the past 50 years. Memory, commemoration, propaganda, heritage, contested interpretation, history as identity, reenactment, ritual, cultural history have all been undertaken and conceptualized for centuries, if not millennia. And there's some really good work going on in archaeology right now and ancient history right now about public history in those areas. We're just beginning, I think, to think about public history longitudinally and to understand our own public history moment as historically embedded and particular. And I'm talking about what happens when we term something public history rather than its manifestation. Its manifestation in a culture. So not the case study particularly, but the thing as described. I've recently been thinking about the past 20 years as some kind of public history moment. I think we can quite happily talk about the public turn in historical studies, particularly in my country, particularly in my country and the US. And this is something that Paul Ashton and Alex Trepasnik also suggested in their book, What is Public History Globally, arguing that contemporary history making has taken a slow public turn. Certainly the institutional and professional support for public history work seems to suggest an epistemological shift of some kind. This turn has happened in many ways outside of the US, although in dialogue and in discussion with North American public history. And I'm trying to think about whether it's a public history turn, or whether public history is itself turned, and we're back to spatial metaphors and movement metaphors again. Has public history become more mainstream, or has it become absorbed into historical thinking, or has it changed mainstream historical thinking in good ways? I don't know the answer to that right now. I would like to talk about it with you guys, and I think we were getting somewhere toward that discussion this weekend. So what would a public history turn mean? It's now pretty much unthinkable that an undergraduate history course in the UK or in Australia or in the US would not have some kind of public history taught as part of an understanding of contemporary historiography. Public has become a crucial kind of space for discussion in quite a lot of these countries. Public history is dependent on particular models and concepts, though, on the idea of history, of public, of institutionalization as a means for articulating and understanding. I think we also need to be quite careful about terms such as global and international if talking about this work. In some ways, maybe the accelerated internationalization of scholarship on public history demonstrates that our theory is redundant. Can we bring this multiple practice into some kind of focus at all? Would there be any point? Would attempting to do so simply maintain some kind of binary, Eurocentric version of things? How do we do justice to the diversity and complexity of this practice? What are the prejudices and biases inherent in our understanding of public history? Is this simply a false cosmopolitanism that we're talking about? In the first issue of International Public History in 2018, I wrote, we need to recognise the huge difference between models of the public, between concepts of the past, and interrogate thoroughly the relatively humanist, privileged, anglophone, progressive, liberal, white underpinnings of historiography, of the discipline of public history itself. There's so much great work in this space, and we've heard a lot about it this weekend. But the institutional orbit, financial strength, and the power, frankly, is still maintained in Europe and North America, despite the best efforts of Public History Weekly, or publishers in South and Latin America, of Lina in China, of Yuna Perry, of work that we've heard about today, of Catalina's work. Despite this, there is still a kind of focus on Europe, I would say. The De Groot book shelf over there kind of tells us this in some ways. There's some German publication, but mostly English. And it's kind of an internationalization which is, in which the lingua franca is English. Next slide, please. Linda Tuay-Smith reminds us that indigenous peoples around the world have other stories to tell which not only question the assumed nature of these ideals and practices that they generate, but also serve to tell an alternative story, the history of Western research through the eyes of the colonized. This is imbricated into the support structures for teaching and learning around the world. Settler colonialism has shaped schooling and educational research in the United States and other settler colonial nation states. Next slide, please. Dipesh Chakrabarty argued that history itself was essentially a centralizing concept that supported the articulation of modernity as a Western entity. He says, insofar as the academic discourse of history as a discourse produced at the institutional site of the university is concerned, and we're going to think about sites again, Europe remains a sovereign theoretical subject of all history. For Chakrabarty, the problem with the proliferation of these other histories is that they were subaltern to the master narrative. There's a peculiar way in which all these other histories tend to become variations on a master narrative that could be called the history of Europe. Chakrabarty's challenge was to provincialize history, to challenge foundationally the principles at stake in knowledge. And again, there's such a locational set of elaborations here that I think is really fascinating. So one of the key things I think we have to have in mind is Chakrabarty's concern, albeit 20 years ago, that non-Western history simply underlined the centrality of types of thought and knowledge production. Which brings me back to Suheima's points about history and its power. Where is public history? How does it as a discipline go forward? How do we gather this together, and indeed should we do so? How can we be inclusive while also being definitional? Do we simply disappear? How can we co-produce with communities without imposing upon them? How can we avoid being extractive whilst working at universities? Can we really decolonize, provincialize, reconfigure? Or is the widening of the conceptualization of public history sufficient to ensure this shift happens? Should we be celebrating national organizations and local groups as the holders of a specific public history understanding? Is that healthy? Next slide, please. Paul Ashton and Alex Trepesnik, in recognizing the plurality of this thing of public history, still reach for a place, a metaphor of place. They said there's no particular global mode or practice of public history. Like culture, public history comes from somewhere. It is local, it's from around here, a locality, region, nation, or state. But it is open to transnational flows and international development. Again, the metaphors of location, of spatial precision abound here. But for them, there is a where always in public history, and this centre of gravity is definitional, in which case the where is also always exclusionary, and I would argue othering. I'm struck by how many definitions of public history attempt to define place. Next slide. Often this is not the university, and the definitional tension between academic and non-academic history is crucial in understanding here. And so, where we practice Marianne Babel writing in 2010. Next slide, please. This where is crucial often in definitions of public history and what the public is. Charles Carl here writes, the discipline of history is not the exclusive domain of the university. But our lack of theorizing where, and in particular the addressing of diversity of publics, might lead us to problems, as Rebecca Conard writes. In the absence of a public historical literature on what public means, programs have incorporated critical practice that fail to make them explicit. Yeah, as I've said, there's a clear warning here in the attacks on history, and as I've highlighted, how do we respond to them? How do we understand this? Indeed, these attacks seem to me to characterize our particular moment of public history and what it is. I was talking to people about reenactment the other day, and there's a great meme about some reenactors suddenly realizing they might be the baddies. And I do wonder whether we might work out at some point that we are actually the problem in comparison with the great mass of conservative public history which is around us. That actually we are, dancing against the stream, we're going the wrong way. That I'm happy with that. But actually we might need to recognize the huge horror that is actual historical knowledge and consciousness right now. That's depressing. So how do we respond to this? As I said, these attacks seem to me to characterize our particular moment of public history. It's been a Western privilege that in past decades history has not been political or weaponized. So how do we deal with it now? And to conclude briefly, I want to talk about this project, Histories at Risk, and how this network tried to work through these ideas in order to understand what public history might mean in the future. As I said, the project was designed to showcase the diversity of our subject, particularly to defend and and partly to understand what and why history is happening right now across the world. Next slide. The network runs an online workshop thinking about contested history and the role of public knowledge in history around the world. And some of the key things that came out of our workshop are up here on the left, on your right, your left, excuse me. We didn't have traditional outputs, we didn't have traditional academic approaches. We used Manchester as a city as a way of reconceptualizing or conceptualizing the where of history. Manchester is historically linked to slavery, a city that's based on cotton, capital, and trade. So this is a conscious attempt to work out and understand this legacy. Using Manchester as a focus has also allowed us to think through the consequences of particular ideas and to consider carefully again Suheimer's question about where history lives, where it's commemorated, where it's kept. In Histories at Risk, we learn and discuss new ways of thinking about history. Non-European, indigenous, oral history, collaborative, co-productive, activist, trans, disabled, from the margins. Recapitulating some of the lessons that we've learned this weekend. Next slide, please. For Owen J. Hercombe, for instance, who wrote for us, trans history is urgently political and has been politicised too. But then, the where of public history is definitely in the public, the toxic space that has been created for debate of trans issues. They say, in this instance, we can regard this case of public hostility as not being against transgender archaeology in specific, but a byproduct of their hostility toward the trans community in general. To add to Owen's comments, I'd like to add another problematic where here, social media, to go with other public discourse, press, and political definitions of the place of history and historical discussion. Next slide, please. The work that we heard in Histories at Risk demonstrate the power and the challenge of public history to defy popular conservative politics. Michelle Asseyi, writing about the ongoing uprising in Iran, points out the openness and generosity that are key here. The new revolution belongs to the people of Iran in all their varieties and ethnicities. History must diversify and be defended, and the flexibility and the generosity of that move is crucial for how we work in the future. Next slide. On the one hand, then, we see the urgency of public history, for instance, in Brazil, as articulated by Bruno Leal. It's about democracy and ethics, but also about methodology. It's fundamentally political here and aggressively defensive. He says, communicating ethical, democratic, and methodological values for him, that's the crucial. Next slide, please. Rashad Al-Ghalani, one of our teacher members, wrote arguing that we need urgently to change what we teach and why. He says, as history teachers, we have a duty to enrich our students. The best way we can do this is through a developed, evolving, and diverse curriculum. And he's from Manchester. He said, history is not a convoluted, colonised winners' stories. I went to school in Manchester, the city that was known as Cottonopolis, yet it was never mentioned where this cotton was coming from. Rashad reminds us that place is crucial, and in particular that in Manchester, a hugely important city in the global slave trade, historical amnesia has been a convoluted, colonised winner's story. So I want to end with some thoughts from participants in our last workshop in Manchester just last month. In particular, what this workshop focused on was co-production and collaboration. Next slide, please. And there's been a lot of discussion about this in the UK and in public history more generally. Laura King and Gary Rivet have recently asked for a relational model of how academics' impact should be valued, in which research is not only disseminated, but used to create sustained and mutually beneficial relationships between researchers and members of the public. And I think that is the kind of crucial thing here. We need to put a lot more pressure, though, on words like co-production, community-led research and collaboration, particularly in the UK context. In some ways, public history seems the perfect location for this work, although there is some disquiet in the UK, particularly around how such approaches might be ambushed by wider university neoliberal agendas. Next slide, please. In our workshop, participants took on Suheimer's questions about where history was and challenged each other. And here are some responses. And I particularly like here the idea that academics be public resources. It feels like this is a long way away in the country that I work in. Indeed, many felt that academics exclude academic jargon, language is dialogue. Many of the participants felt that academic discussion was, whether rightly or wrongly, problematic for them. And there was a tension between a public need and a perceived academic intransigence. Next slide, please. It was clear from the discussion that many people in the room thought the decolonising and institutional talk of equality and diversity was lacking in action. Structural problems were hardly ever discussed, let alone addressed. Participants wanted an entirely new history. They asked, can history ever be protected from being weaponised? How can real evidence be protected from co-option and denial? Part of the problem was about redistribution of resources. And we need to recognise that inequality is one of the crucial issues when thinking about history, public, and identity. And as one participant said, there needs to be a radical shift rather than business as usual. Are we, the institutions, the disciplines of history, the public, audiences, students, librarians and archivists, museum curators, artists, ready to do this, really? So just a kind of few words to sum up. So Jaime challenges us to think about, next slide please, the spaces of history and its exclusions, the exclusions inherent in its practice. Does or might public history answer this? To my mind, yes. Carolyn Dinshaw talked about the queerness of embodied history, or thinking about bodies in history, and I think that is a kind of crucial way of thinking about how we approach stuff. We need to develop a clear activist public history to answer further. We need to define an ethics of practice and of future work. I think public history is clearly activist. Next slide, thanks. But we need to maintain a self-consciousness about our purpose and to understand as much as possible the challenges we're faced with. We need to understand that exchange practice, be generous and open, be prepared to challenge and change completely what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. We need to work on our ideas of solidarity and of sharing. History needs to be revised, but also defended. But an inclusive, open history somehow also needs to be shared, given, open up. We need to let it go, I think, in some ways. And the final words I would like to go to these guys who are the History of Risk group, who outlined their key thoughts for us, as they've written here, which you probably can't read, which I've turned into a word cloud, which is my last slide. We have that. Yeah, there we go. Outlined their key thoughts for us and brought to us some of the crucial concepts that we might now explore alongside them. Thank you very much for listening.